Hi, my name is Danielle, and I am a winner of the SURF-Humanities grant, and this is my research that I did over the summer. This research was done under the mentorship of Professor Faith Barter from the English department. This is my work, Fungibility as Possibility, Exploitation, and Performance in Jordan Peele's Us. It's largely focused on the theoretical concept of fungibility as it can be applied to Jordan Peele's film Us. So fungibility is this concept that comes from Black feminist scholarship, as well as Afro-pessimism, and it can be accredited to Hortense Spillers and C.D. Hartman, who are two major contributors to the field of Black feminist theory. Spillers is the one who kind of came up with the beginnings of this concept, and then Hartman was the one who developed it and applied the term fungibility to it. And so fungibility can be described as this idea that in the time of slavery, Black bodies were treated as commodities. They were seen as a territory of cultural and political maneuver. Um, and this can be applied to Black men, women, and children at this time who were treated as the commodity. And that essentially means that Black people were treated in this time as currency that could be bought, sold, traded, exchanged, and replaced indefinitely over and over and over again. But in the world of Black feminist theory, when we discuss fungibility, um, we talk a lot about how Black women in particular were subjected to this kind of violence. So when we look at Black women's experience with fungibility, we can see that the captive female body locates precisely a moment of converging political and social vectors that mark the flesh as prime commodity of exchange in this time, essentially meaning that the Black female body was experiencing compounding vulnerabilities, making it so that Black women were subjected not only to race-based violence, but also sex-based violence. They were experiencing sexual violence as well as, racial violence. So there are two things that come up when it comes to fungibility. There is the ways that Black women had compounding vulnerabilities, but there's also this idea of ungendering, which we'll get into a little bit later, but also has to do with the fact that Black women were experiencing um, the difficulties, the struggles of being both a woman and being Black, but they were not experiencing the protections that come with being a woman in this time. They were not experiencing the same protections that white women would receive just due to their womanhood. And so this is a sort of ungendering as well. Fungibility both causes Black women to experience a deeper form of subjection while also keeping them from experiencing some of the protections that women normally would receive. So fungibility also assumes a lack of agency, meaning that the fungibility of the commodity makes the captive body an abstract and empty vessel vulnerable to the projection of others' feelings, ideas, desires, and values. This comes from Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection. And this essentially means that in the time of chattel slavery, the body is reduced to a thing, and it is reduced to a thing that's essence is being for the captor. It is not being for oneself, it is being for the captor, being for the whims, the ideas, the desires of the captor. This strips the fungible body of all forms of agency and autonomy. And this can be seen when we talk and think about the tethered in us. So if we look at the tethered, who are a population that are not just Black individuals, it kind of is the whole of the American populace, but it can be seen in some ways as sort of an allegory for the enslaved population because the tethered experience this same kind of ungendering, unhumaning, unsouling, in which they are seen as less than. So if we look at it in the context of the tethered from Jordan Peele's Us, we can see that the tethered were a population created for exploitation, similar to the enslaved population in the United States. So if we look at Red's speech later in the film, she states specifically that the tethered were created for the US government to control those above ground, essentially stating that the tethered were created as being for the captor, as being for the US government, as a tool for control, not as individuals, not as people, but as tools, as things. So that comes with kind of these ideas of replacement and exchange. This idea that those below ground could replace those above ground, those below ground could control those above ground, that their lives were exchangeable, replaceable, controllable, that kind of thing. Of course, we also see ungendering, which I explained earlier was about the experience of the vulnerability of femaleness without the protections of it. So ungendering, of course, if we look at Red and Adelaide specifically, but also all the women who are part of the tethered population, we see that women are not exempt from being part of the tether. They're not exempt from life below ground and all that comes with that, which when we look at Red's story in particular, in her first speech, she talks about the time when Adelaide met her husband, and that at the same time, Red, the tethered counterpart, she meets Abraham, who is the tethered underground version of Gabe, the above ground husband. So she is completely without agency. She does not get to choose who she loves, who she marries. She does not get to choose how many children she has. She has to mirror what happens above ground. And so this is a profound loss of agency, profound loss of gendering, a profound loss of like her ability to love, be attracted to somebody, to mother her kids. She totally loses this idea of mothering her kids. And um in Spiller's is Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, she expresses this idea of ungendering, that femininity and motherhood loses its sacredness. Motherhood as a female right is lost in the time of slavery. And this is exactly what Red experiences throughout being her life as a tethered individual. She does not get to mother her children because she has to make the same choices that are made above ground. She has to have the same children that are made above ground. There's no recourse for her to assert her own agency. There's this kind of forced mirroring. However, this idea of fungibility as a complete loss of agency is troubled in the film just by way of the film's plot itself. So even though Red expresses that she can't have children the way that she has to have the same children that Red has, that she has to give herself a C-section, that she has to be with Gabe and have his children and be, his sort of wife underground, we see that she's sort of performing a fungibility that doesn't necessarily exist because she uses that fungibility in different ways to exercise her own agency. So fungibility actually is used throughout this film as a site of possibility, which we can see is a theoretical concept from Tiffany Lethabo King in her article, The Labor of Rereading Plantation Landscapes Fungibly. Essentially, what she's talking about is that fungibility can be a site of possibility. Fungibility can be taken advantage of in order to exercise agency in conditions where agency is not allowed, essentially. So both Red and Adelaide actually exercise subjectivity and agency throughout the film. Particularly, we can see this when they switch places the first time as children, which is like the major plot twist of the film. It comes out that Adelaide was one of the tethered, and then she and Red met in this mirrored hall and switched places. This was an exercise of her agency. She was able, or something was able to guide them together, and she was able to make that switch. She was no longer mirroring, she was exercising her agency. However, when Adelaide, or when, I guess, when Red comes down underneath, and becomes one of the tethered, she loses that agency. She becomes unsouled or ungendered. She becomes unhuman. And she takes on this role of fungibility. She takes on this lack of agency and mirrors what happens above, which leads her to become a dancer the way that Adelaide above ground becomes a dancer, which leads her to exercise her autonomy once again in order to lead the revolution of the tethered and come above ground to stop mirroring and to start kind of killing and replacing those above ground. So the exercise of agency troubles the idea that they're fungible in the first place. Of course, this is not without the caveat that there can only really be one. They can't both exercise their agency at the same time. The reality of fungibility and the reality of exploitation is that even when they have the agency, in the reality of racist, sexist society, there is no true autonomy or agency. There's only room for one to have subjectivity. So we can see this in that final dance between them, in which Adelaide and Red kind of finally converge. They finally kind of become one, and the lines between them blur. And ultimately, Adelaide, the original tethered, kills Red, who was originally above ground. This kind of exposes the real horror and reality of fungibility and subjection, essentially showing that even in the case where Black women do get to assert their own authority and autonomy, they are still in certain ways subjected to fungibility and marginalized by it.